The year is 1348. A Genoese ship drifts into the Sicilian port of Messina. It carries rats, it carries fleas, and it carries a secret, a sickness unlike anything Europe has ever seen. Within weeks, entire families vanish. Churches overflow with bodies. Unseen forces stalk the alleyways of Florence and Paris. In less than 5 years, up to 50 million people will die. The world they leave behind will never be the same. This is the story of how a microbe, the Black Death, rewired the entire world, socially, economically, and spiritually, and laid the groundwork for a new age. Our story begins in 1346, far to the east. The plague starts to stir on the vast steppes of Central Asia, perhaps somewhere near modern-day Kyrgyzstan or western China. For centuries, trade routes like the Silk Road had connected east and west, carrying silks, spices, and ideas. Now, they carried something else. The bacterium Yersinia pestis traveled silently, hosted by fleas living on black rats, which in turn hitched rides on merchant caravans and ships. By 1347, the plague had reached the edge of Europe. A grim turning point occurred during the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post in Crimea. The attacking Golden Horde army, ravaged by the disease, reportedly used a terrifying form of biological warfare. They catapulted plague-infested corpses over the city walls. While the details of this event are debated by historians, what's certain is that the epidemic spread like wildfire among both besiegers and the besieged. Fleeing the chaos, Genoese ships escaped Kaffa and sailed west, becoming floating vessels of death. In October 1347, 12 of these ships docked at Messina, Sicily. The locals were horrified to find most of the sailors either dead or gravely ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The authorities quickly ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried ashore. The plague had arrived in Europe. From Messina, the disease spread with breathtaking speed, following the well-worn paths of medieval trade. It moved from port to port, then inland along rivers and roads. Within months, it reached the bustling Italian city-states of Florence and Venice. By the next year, it was consuming Paris and London. By 1351, it had torn through most of Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people perished in Europe alone. That's a third to half of the entire population, gone in less than 5 years. Imagine what that was like. Picture a city where the morning brings not the usual sounds of vendors and carts, but an eerie silence, broken only by the constant tolling of church bells for the dead. The air is thick with the smell of death and burning herbs, as people desperately try to ward off the unseen poison. In Florence, the chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that the living could barely keep up with burying the dead. Huge trenches were dug for mass graves, where bodies were layered like lasagna with cheese. In London, archaeological evidence from the East Smithfield Cemetery reveals the scale of the crisis. Skeletons of men and women of all ages were found, a testament to how the plague indiscriminately struck down the young and old, rich and poor. Fear was universal, but the responses varied. Some locked themselves away, hoping to wait out the storm. Others abandoned their families and fled to the countryside, believing it was a divine punishment they could outrun. And in the darkness of fear and confusion, many looked for someone to blame. Scapegoating ran rampant, leading to horrific violence. Jewish communities, falsely accused of poisoning wells, faced brutal persecution and massacres across Europe, like the one in Basel in 1349 where hundreds were burned alive. The sheer loss of life didn't just cause personal grief. It shattered the very foundations of the medieval world. For centuries, feudalism had defined society. Peasants, or serfs, were tied to the land, working for a lord in exchange for protection. It was a rigid, hierarchical system. But what happens when 30 to 50% of the workforce vanishes in a few years? Suddenly, labor became incredibly scarce, and therefore, valuable. The survivors found themselves in a new world of opportunity. For the first time, peasants could demand higher wages. They could leave their ancestral lands in search of better deals. Serfdom, the bedrock of the feudal economy, began to crumble. Landowners who had once held all the power were now scrambling to find workers, often forced to offer better pay and conditions. Across England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a direct consequence of these new social dynamics. The old order was breaking down. The economy was thrown into chaos. Initially, trade faltered as cities shut their gates and ships were quarantined. But over time, new patterns emerged. With fewer people to feed, huge swathes of farmland were abandoned. Fields that had been cultivated for generations lay fallow, and nature began to reclaim the land. The focus of agriculture shifted from grain to livestock, which required less labor. In the cities, guilds lost their tight grip as experienced artisans died, opening up opportunities for new people and new methods. The balance of power began to shift from the rural manors of the nobility to the increasingly independent towns and cities. Amidst this chaos, the spiritual world was also shaken to its core. How could God allow such a catastrophe? For some, the plague was a call to extreme piety. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to appease an angry God. But for others, faith wavered. The Church, which had been the unquestionable authority on life and death, seemed powerless. Priests who bravely tended to the sick died alongside their parishioners. Prayers went unanswered. The institution's prestige suffered a blow from which it would take centuries to recover. This spiritual crisis was reflected in the art and culture of the time. The optimistic, serene art of the early 14th century gave way to macabre and morbid themes. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, and children, to their graves. It was a stark reminder that death was the great equalizer. This obsession with mortality and the questioning of old certainties, however dark, helped pave the way for the humanism and intellectual curiosity that would define the coming Renaissance. It's crucial to remember that the Black Death was a global phenomenon, not just a European one. It traveled along the same networks that facilitated commerce and cultural exchange, highlighting just how interconnected the medieval world was. From Asia, through the Middle East, and into North Africa, the pandemic left a trail of destruction. It demonstrated that civilizations were linked by fragile threads of trade, and when one part of the network collapsed, the shockwaves were felt everywhere. Out of this unprecedented disaster, a profound transformation began. The Black Death didn't just kill. It acted as a brutal but effective agent of change. By shattering the old feudal bonds, it created a more modern labor market where wages were negotiated and workers had mobility. The weakening of the nobility and the church allowed monarchs to centralize power, laying the groundwork for the nation-states of modern Europe. The decline in population also meant that, per capita, wealth increased for the survivors. There was more land, more food, and more resources to go around. This newfound prosperity, combined with a desire to understand the world in the wake of the Church's failure, spurred a revival in education and science. New universities were founded, and a more secular approach to knowledge began to take root. In essence, the catastrophe rewired the very hardware of society. As one historian put it, "If having the population doesn't transform civilization, what would?" The plague did not simply disappear after 1351. It returned in waves for centuries, with subsequent outbreaks continuing to shape European society. The population wouldn't recover to its pre-plague levels for over 150 years. Yet, in the ruins of the old world, the seeds of the new were already sprouting. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of a market economy, the very concept of individual freedom, all have roots in the great rupture caused by the Black Death. It's a powerful and ironic legacy. A disease that seemed to signal the end of the world instead became a catalyst for its rebirth. The agents of change were death and destruction, but the ultimate outcome was a new beginning. What humanity feared most forced them to rebuild their world on entirely new terms. The Black Death didn't just take lives. It took the old world and rewired it for something new. So next time you think about wages, work, social mobility, or even the layout of our modern world, remember that the legacy of that plague still hums quietly in the background of your daily life. Thanks for watching. If you were inspired by the story of how death rewrote civilization, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most transformative moments. See you next time.